is how to use Okta Workflows to iterate through a paginated API response, right? And to be a little bit more specific, you're gonna learn how to build a pagination or recursion when you get a large API response. And again, you'll see examples of that in just a few minutes. Now, a few housekeeping items. So the event is being recorded and it will be available on the same page on Crowdcast once we are done with the live event. I will also upload the recording to YouTube sometime tomorrow, and then you'll get a message with the link to YouTube and also any other resources we use in the meetup today. If you would like, tell us where you're joining from. It's always interesting to know. I am from the San Francisco Bay Area, and AJ, where are you joining from?
I'm joining from Redwood City, also in the Bay Area, San Francisco.
Awesome. Very cool. Let me see. All right. All right, what else? Follow our channel. So if you, the Okta Workflows channel on Crowdcast, and then you'll be notified when we go live. And then there should be a button or a link in the upper right corner. And then also, if you would like, tell us what events you would like to see in the future. And I think that's it. So let me move off the slide. And let's see here. And Ajay, the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks, Max. So what we're going to cover today is how to, handle these cases where you have a GET call, an API call, and it returns a paginated response. So before we get to that, let me sort of just give you a sense of how we approach that, solving that problem. So think back to your college days, right? There was this function called Factorial. And if I asked you for a factorial of 5, the answer would be 5 times 4 times 3 times 2, all the way till times 1. And that would be the answer. There is another way of looking at that problem. So you could say, what is factorial 5? And I know Max likes to think recursion. So Max, what is the answer to factorial 5?
If I remember from my college days, it's 5 times factorial of 4.
Right. And what is factorial 4?
4 times factorial 3.
Exactly. So this is another way of looking at this problem. And this is the principle of recursion. So you will see that the answer of factorial 5 is defined in terms of a factorial function. So it's 5 times the same function, but with a different number. So when you think about API data that's coming across multiple pages, the analogy is very similar. You make a call to get page 1 data and a reference to how you can get the next page of data. And you keep that particular URL and you say, okay, I make the call to that next page of data. And then the answer comes back. Well, here's the data, but also here's the next way to get the next page, right? Until we have reached an end. So the key principle of this approach is to know what is that starting number in the case of the factorial example, what is the formula, how to increment or decrement, and what happens if you're not at the end, and what determines when you end. So in the factorial example, factorial 1 is simply 1, right? So it is whatever you've computed till that point. So when you think about a paginated API call, it's the same thing. You need to know how to make that first API call, how to make the next API call, what does it entail, incrementing or decrementing, and then when to end. When we map that to Okta Workflows, here are the basic principles. You have a start flow, which says, I'm going to start here by calling this helper flow called Factorial. And I pass these numbers, right? The number and a factorial so far. So in that initial case, we trigger this helper flow, and then we prepare for the next call by saying, okay, I have to subtract 1, and then check to see if I've reached the end. So if I've reached number 1, then I go ahead and return the factorial so far. Otherwise, I go ahead and do the multiplication and then call the same flow, right? Call that helper flow with a different set of numbers. And then at the end, return. So when you look at a paginated API and its documentation, these are the key principles to look out for. First of all, what is that API call? So this is a sample from Auth0, Customer Identity Cloud. So it says get API v2 connections. Okay, so I know what this first API call looks like. The first time you call this endpoint, what you need to do is omit the from parameter. So there's some way to make that first call. But how do I know what to do next for the next page? Well, it gives you a clue in the documentation to say, look for that next link header. So in other words, when you make that API call, it returns the data, but it also tells you what the URL endpoint is to get the next page of data. And how do you know you've reached the end? Well, you will know that because you don't get that next page, right? So when you look at a paginated API and its documentation, these are the key points that you want to look for. Again, it's the same structure. So you have a main flow, you call that flow, you make that API call, you prepare for the next call, you do a check to see if you've reached the end, and if you're not at the end, you make a call to that same helper flow, and if you are at the end, then return, right? So what I've done is I've got a basic structure. All these cards with green are note cards, so they're like comments. And if you see the way the logic is, this middle part, right, the first part, perform API call, is exactly what you would expect. How do I make that API call? Prepare for the next call. And then there's a conditional check. One branch calls the same flow, the other one just returns. And this ensures by putting in this end check that you don't end up with an infinite loop. So let's go ahead and look at it in Okta Workflows. I will start off by just quickly demoing the flows, but then I will also build it from scratch. Okay, basic structure. In the Factorial example, I prepare for the next call first, and then do the conditional check, and then call the same flow and return, right? And you can switch this around as you will see the difference between the Factorial flow and the paginated flow. Let me run the Factorial example for you. So we had 5 as the number we were computing. It runs through, initially passes in 5, gets a result of 120. But what happens within the Factorial function is of interest. So when I look at it, the first time it comes in with 5 and 5. The next time it comes with 4, and it's keeping a count of that Factorial computation. Gets to 3, gets to 2, and at that point, you know that we have to end, right? Now let's look at a paginated response. So I've picked this random API that I found on the internet, randomuser.me, so it returns some random users. And the documentation indicates that I can set how many records it returns. For simplicity, I'm going to use limit equals 1. Now, obviously, I could set a higher number, in which case, because it's an array, it would just have more records in a single API call. We have a workflow template, make API requests with the HTTP raw request card, that you can take a look at to see how to process JSON when you have multiple records. But for the sake of this crowdcast session, I'm just going to keep it simple with a limit of 1. The documentation tells me to provide a seed. and there's a running page. So my limit is going to be defined as I want to be able to get 3 pages of data. So let's see a demo. In this case, what I've done is followed that same factorial template by seeding it with page 0. So I first increment the page number and then make the calls. The documentation for this API says the first page is actually with page equals 1. So when I look at the main workflow, you can see I first add 1 and then do the check. I make the call. I extract out the first name from the first entry. Of course, if it was an array with multiple records, I would use a list for each, for example. Take a look at that workflow template. And then here's the key point. I call this back with the next page. Now I've shifted the logic a little bit with this next sample, where I'm doing the same thing, but I'm starting with asking for page 1. So that means that I actually go ahead and make the call here with page 1. I perform the API call. I get the value, so Laura. The next one is Johan, and the third one is Carl. And you notice that because my exit last stage is when I reach 3 pages, I go ahead and say if total is less than or equal to 3, I perform that logic of calling the same helper flow again, but I'm at the end, I just return. So let's build this from scratch. Now, in the resources that we will provide as a part of this session, I've got a basic template. And this basic template literally makes this a simple matter of filling in the logic. So this will be provided to you. So in this session, let me go ahead and start. I'm using that basic template, and I'm going to construct that call to the random user API endpoint and build it from scratch. So I have some query parameters, so I'm going to construct an object for that. So I'll put my seed, I'll put my limit 1, and I'll put my running page, and I'll say that this is my running page, right? My next call is the API call. So I have an API call, and this is a really powerful feature of Okta Workflows, where I can access any cloud accessible API endpoint and bake that into my identity process logic. So this is randomuser.me/API. So let me grab this. The query parameter are these values here. If I didn't need headers, I could uncheck that. In your example, you may want to send in headers. So in case that's needed, you'll keep that. And then let me go ahead and just get the value. So you'll notice that over here, it's an object. So I'm going to get and so this is based on looking at the output. I can see its results. It's an array, so .0, name, and first. So that's the notation here. So my first section that I have filled out is performing the API call. And I've filled in that section. Prepare for the next call. Okay, so in this particular case, it is a simple matter of incrementing that page number. So let me go ahead, grab that running page, and add 1 to it. Great. I've done that part. When do the recursive calls end? Okay, so let me go ahead and say that I'm going to get my 3 pages. Okay, so let's go over here. At this point, let me save. I've saved the flow. And what that allows me to do is come over here, pick this helper flow. The design tool just sort of goes and introspects what those input parameters are. And so now it's got running page here. So a quick tip is that you can pin this first card, so it becomes easy to keep this card handy. But in this particular case, my next call is going to be based on the total. So let me go ahead and drag and drop this total over to the running page. Now, in this case, I don't need any return result, so I'll leave that blank. And then at the end, I'm just going to return again, and it's blank. So let me go ahead and save. And turn this flow on. So the next part that I have to do is come over to the start flow. So over here, I'm going to go ahead, click this. It introspects and figures out the input parameters to that helper flow, and I'm going to set that running page to be 1. Okay, so at this point, what we have done is we've literally gone through a fill-in-the-blank experience to be able to handle the Paginated API. So let me go ahead, just test this out.
Ajay, there's a question and I'll read it to you, and you can tell me if you want. You can answer it at the end. But there's a question from Matthew. Let me click so we start answering it. What if you don't know the max page count and want all records for all pages?
Right, exactly. So when you actually look at the documentation of these Paginated API, right, it will tell you what the condition is when there are no more records. It could be that you make an API call and you get back nothing, right? And so in this case, when do we know we've reached the end? When next is no longer included in the response. So this is the typical Paginated API documentation that you will see. So that condition where in my current example, I'm just setting a max of page 3 would be a different condition for you. And what you would check is to see if that next is no longer included in the response if you were using this particular API endpoint. Okay.
All right, thank you.
The logic is exactly the same. You have to figure out how to make that first API call. What do I need for my subsequent API call, and when to end? And while the details of the logic are dependent on the API endpoint, the structure is exactly the same.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. So we got this. We've made this call to the running page. So let's go into the main workflow here and look at this. And we said we wanted 3 pages. That's why you see 3 executions of this. On the first execution, running page was 1. It comes through, it makes that call. It gets the first user is Laura, and then it adds to be able to make the next call. So if I were to implement that other case of the documentation that I showed you, this would be replaced by retrieving that next link. Come over here. If not at the end, instead of passing a running page like I am over here, it would be passing that next link. And this would be that next link, right? So then it goes ahead and iterates through. So for the second time around, imagine I had a next link. I would go and get that second user by changing the URL endpoint in that example, but over here it's just page 2, so that I can get Johan. I increment, so in that documentation example, it will be getting the next link, coming over here, making that call with that next link, comes back, and then here in this case, it's running page 3. In the documentation example, it would be the next link. And you would say, okay, the next link is null, right? So I come over here and I could have a condition which says it's null. Or I would make the call and then I would check that in the result that there was, I got some data back, but the next link was null. And then, so when I extracted it out, I'd go, oh yeah, that's null. So I've reached the end. So that condition would say null, it's null. And then when I go over here, it would trigger this branch and return. So that's the way you can handle paginated API responses. So as I said, I will provide this folder structure as a part of artifacts for this session. So what you would do is you would read the documentation, you would understand the logic, right? Just those same points should be clear in your mind. And then what you would do is just literally go into this basic template and fill in this blank, right? Make that API call, prepare for the next call, set the condition, save, select the helper flow, pass the parameter, and then come back, save the flow, turn it on, run this start flow, select the helper flow, pass in that first URL, save it, test it. That's your go-to method for dealing with paginated API. So now what I'll do is I'll just take another step. Now that we've built the flow, we've seen how easy it is. What are some of the workflow system limits to keep in mind? So Okta limits the number of recursive calls to 250. And we've placed this high limit because we want to balance what typical scenarios we see, but also protect the service from infinite loops where people forget to put that end condition or they haven't set it correctly. So what does that actually mean? So in our example today, we had a limit equals 1. So every API call, we got back 1 record. But I could have set that to whatever the max that API endpoint would support. So let's say that the max from an API call was 200 records. So each time I made the invocation of the API, I could get a maximum of 200 records. With these recursive calls being limited to 250, that means that with this approach, for that case, I would be able to retrieve 200 times 250, which would be 50,000 records. Now, some other considerations to keep in mind that are less rare that you actually run into is that the workflow's instance memory limit is 100 megabytes. So that's a huge amount of memory, right? And that means that the variables memory should be less than 100 megabytes. Very rare that people end up running into that. The payload limit is 1 megabyte. If any particular message in the flow history exceeds that, it's not stored, so you just wouldn't be able to see it through that execution history, but it is actually performing the operation internally. So that's just a display limit. So these are some of the considerations. And as you can see, it is really easy to make these paginated API calls. So with that, Max, are there any other questions?
No, I don't see any other questions, but folks, if you have any questions, again, please put them in chat, or you can also put them in the Q&A section, and we'll answer them or try to answer them. Oh, very cool. I forgot to mention that, Ajay, this is your second time here with us, right?
Right. Yeah.
The first was in May. So thank you for hosting again with us. We should definitely.
I sort of reach out to Max every time I see a pattern of questions coming in. And the pattern this time was people were struggling with how they should work with Paginated API. So I reached out to Max and scheduled this topic. So hopefully this is helpful. The other template that I was referring you to was making API requests with the HTTP request card. So in this particular case, I show you how you can actually process that JSON that comes back. So I use the Amazon Pet Store API and show you how you can work with that object construct to create the query parameters, make the API call. I also include in this template some additional ways to invoke API based on what you're looking for. So, for example, if you're using the where content type being application X www form URL encoded, this one shows you how you could make that call, and it uses the standard Postman endpoints so that you can get a sense of how to make those API calls with Okta Workflows. So do check this particular template out. I think it would be used in combination with being able to process the paginated API example that we went through today.
And we can include, I'll include the link to the template in the message, in the follow-up message that we send out tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, very cool, folks. Yeah, I don't see any questions, but again, if please put them in chat. But also, Ajay, what's a good way to contact you if people have questions after this?
That's a curveball question. I hadn't really thought about that, but since you're the host here of these sessions, which are I've heard really good things about the value of these sessions, Max. So there is a way to get in touch with you through the various Slack channels, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So Slack channel, but I'll put my I didn't have my email on the first slide, but I'll put it, and then you can send me an email, and then Ajay and I will get back to you. So here I'll well, okay. Well, very good. I don't see any more questions, but again, you know how to contact us. Again, the recording will be, so on Crowdcast, it will be right here, right after we end. On YouTube, it will be tomorrow. And then again, we'll send a message tomorrow with resources. And as I also said at the beginning, if you have any ideas for future events, please let us know. I also want to quickly tell you about upcoming events that we have. So there's now a monthly Getting Started online meetup, Getting Started with Okta Workflows. It's every first Tuesday of the month. And so the next one is next Tuesday, December 5th, I believe. It's at 8 a.m. In the morning. Now there's one in January, and then I'll schedule February, March, and so on. So now it's a monthly event that I'm doing, and I cover the fundamentals, and I build a different flow each time. So it's not the same flow, the different flow that I built. Well, very cool. I don't see questions, but Ajay, thank you so much for coming back and hosting with us. Again, we'll definitely have you back in the future. And folks who joined, or if you're going to be watching the recording, again, thank you for again being here with us.
Yep. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you, Max, for hosting these. I've heard that these are really valuable for our customers.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Cool, Jacob. Thank you. Awesome. Then we'll see you again. I hope to see you next week or at a future Workflows online meetup. Thanks. Bye.